She was 54 years old, and she had just lost everything that had a number attached to it. Not in a fire, not in a flood. In a lawyer's office on a Wednesday afternoon in February, in Sudbury, Ontario, where the snow had been falling sideways since morning, and the parking meters on Elm Street still charged you even when the city forgot to plow. The lawyer read from a document in a flat, careful voice, the way lawyers do when they have said the same sentences to different people for 30 years, and have learned to keep their face out of it. And when he was done reading, Delia Marchetti walked out of that office with $43 in her checking account, a 2009 Civic that needed a new alternator, and the signed paperwork for a marriage that no longer existed. 28 years. 2 kids grown and gone to Calgary and Vancouver. 1 house in New Sudbury that had always been in Renee's name, because back in 1996, when they bought it, she had been the one making less, and he had been the one with the credit, and she had not thought to ask why that meant her name had to be the one left off. She had not thought to ask a great many things back then. She had been 32, and she had believed, the way you believe in certain things when you are 32, that love was a kind of protection. What she had not known, what nobody had told her, was that somewhere inside the walls of a decommissioned ferry terminal on the north shore of Lake Huron, in a town so small it did not appear on the highway signs, in a space between 2 panels of old-growth cedar that had been sealed shut for 22 years, was something her late mother had left there, something that would take everything Delia thought she knew about the woman who had raised her and turn it quietly inside out. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find you at the right moment, take just 1 second and hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from today. We love knowing where in this country our stories reach. Now let's go back to Delia. Delia Marchetti had spent most of her adult life making things comfortable for other people. She had a gift for it, the particular gift of women who grew up watching their mothers do the same thing and absorbed it without anyone ever calling it a skill. She could walk into a room and know within 30 seconds what it needed. A window cracked. The lamp moved 2 feet to the left. The tension that had been building since Tuesday named and set down gently on the table where everyone could see it and decide what to do with it. She had worked for 21 years as a resettlement coordinator for a nonprofit in Sudbury that helped newcomers navigate the machinery of arriving, the paperwork, the housing lists, the school registrations, the particular bureaucratic exhaustion of trying to build a life in a language that is still sharp at the edges. She was good at it. She was. Her clients told her again and again, the first person in this country who had made them feel like they were not a problem to be processed, but a person to be known. She had given that job everything she had, and she had given her marriage everything that was left. Her mother, Estelle Marchetti née Tremblay, was a woman from Chapleau who had come south to Sudbury at 20, and stayed because of a man, which is how a great many people came to be somewhere they did not originally intend. Estelle had worked the counter at a hardware store for 34 years, and she had been by every external measure an entirely ordinary woman. She made good butter tarts. She kept a garden that never quite got ahead of the weeds, but never entirely surrendered to them either. She called Delia every Sunday at 11 and talked for exactly 20 minutes, and then said she had something on the stove, which was not always true, but which was Estelle's way of drawing a clean edge around a thing. She had been widowed when Delia was 9, and she had raised Delia and her younger brother Thierry alone, on a hardware store salary, and she had never once complained about it out loud, which meant she had complained about it in other ways that Delia only understood much later. Estelle died of a stroke at 71, on a January morning, alone in the house in Chapleau with the radio on. Delia had driven up for the funeral and packed the house and dealt with the small estate, a few $1,000s, a paid-off car, some jewelry, and had understood for the first time that her mother had lived a very contained life. Everything in that house fit into a story Delia already knew. There were no surprises. Estelle Marchetti was a woman who had not left surprises, or so Delia had believed. That was 4 years before Renee handed her the divorce papers across a kitchen table where they had eaten 11,000 breakfasts together. He did not do it cruelly. That was almost the harder thing. Renee Marchetti was not a cruel man. He was a man who had, somewhere in his mid-50s, discovered that he was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with whether another person was present, and had decided, with the same careful, methodical logic he applied to everything else in his life, that the answer to that loneliness was elsewhere. Her name was Joanne. She was 51. She taught high school French in Hanmer. Delia did not blame Joanne. She had been the age Joanne was now when she stopped being the person Renee reached for, and she had not noticed until it was already years in the past. She moved out of the house in January. She could not afford anything in Sudbury on her salary alone, not with the way rents had gone, not with her salary frozen for the third consecutive year, and her savings dissolved in the machinery of the legal proceedings. She was staying in the spare room of her colleague Priya's apartment, sleeping on a fold-out bed with a bar in the middle of it that found her spine every night around 3 a.m. She was 54 years old, and she was starting over in a borrowed room, and she had not yet found a way to say that sentence without it landing on her chest like a stone. It was Priya who took the call from the estate lawyer, because Delia had been in a client session and had her phone turned over on her desk. Priya wrote the message on a sticky note and pressed it to Delia's monitor with the particular careful gentleness of a person who senses the note contains something that will require sitting down. It was from a lawyer in Thessalon, a town on the north shore of Lake Huron, halfway between Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie, where Highway 17 ran close enough to the water that in certain seasons you could smell the lake through a cracked car window. Delia had been through Thessalon perhaps a dozen times in her life and had stopped once at a gas station. She did not know a single person there. She had not known her mother knew anyone there either. The lawyer's name was Gerald Willett, and he had been trying to reach her for 6 weeks. The estate, he explained over the phone, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a man in his 70s, who had been practicing in a small town long enough to have handled the legal affairs of every family within 40 kilometers, had been held in a secondary instrument attached to Estelle's will. A codicil, he said, added 8 months before her death, naming Delia as the sole beneficiary of a property in Thessalon that Estelle had held in trust for 22 years. What property? Delia asked. There was a pause on Gerald Ouellet's end of the line, not the pause of a man who didn't know. The pause of a man deciding how much to say before she got there. It was a ferry terminal, he said. Or it was. Once your mother called it the landing. I think it's better if you come and see for yourself, Ms. Marchetti. There's something she left inside that she specifically asked me not to describe over the telephone. Delia drove up on a Saturday in March, the kind of March day that Ontario produces as a reminder that it has not finished with winter yet. Flat gray sky, granular snow that couldn't commit to actually falling. The highway slicked with the particular invisible ice that announces itself only after the fact. She drove the Civic with the bad alternator and talked to it the whole way there, which was a habit she had developed recently, and which she had decided she was not going to feel embarrassed about. Thessalon sat on a flat curve of the north shore, where the land came gently down to the lake, and then changed its mind and held itself slightly back, as though uncertain. The town was the kind of place that had been somewhat larger once, and had settled into what it was now with a certain quiet dignity. The main street still upright, the marina still functional, the Ukrainian church with its copper dome still green against the gray sky. The hardware store still open even though 3 generations had kept it open through 3 different economic reasons to close. Gerald Willette's office was above the pharmacy. He was, in fact, in his 70s, a small compact man with white hair and glasses on a cord, and the handshake of a man who has been trusted with difficult things and knows the weight of that. He gave her a folder of documents and a key on a plain metal ring, and he looked at her for a moment the way Del McGuire had looked at Lorna. That long, patient look of a person who knows what is coming and is giving you the last moment of not knowing it. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Gerald Willette said. I practiced law in this town for 46 years. In that time, I had perhaps 4 clients who understood that the most important legal work is not the work you do when things are good. It's the work you do when you want to make sure something survives you. He slid the key across the desk. The property is 12 minutes east on the Lakeshore Road. White building, red roof, sits back from the water. You'll know it when you see it. Can you tell me anything else? Delia asked. I can tell you, he said, that your mother came in here on a November afternoon 8 years before she died, and sat in that chair you're sitting in, and told me she had been keeping a secret for long enough, and she wanted to make sure that when she was gone, the right person found it. He looked at her steadily. She said you were the right person because you had always known how to sit with people while they figured out where they were going. The Lakeshore Road ran east through a country of bare birch and frozen marsh. The lake visible in glimpses through the trees, flat and pewter-colored and enormous. Delia drove slowly. She did not know what she was driving toward, and the not knowing sat in the car with her, taking up space. The building appeared around a bend in the road exactly as Gerald Ouellette had described. White clapboard. Red metal roof gone slightly rust-orange at the seams, sitting back from the shoreline on a cleared lot with a gravel apron in front and a dock reaching out into the lake that still looked, improbably, structurally sound. A faded painted sign above the double front doors read Ferry Landing, Lake Huron Coastal. Below it, in smaller letters that had been there longer, Passenger Surface. And below that, so faded she had to get out of the car and walk up to read it, Waiting room always open. She stood there in the granular snow reading those 3 words for a long moment. The key worked. The door swung inward on hinges that were cold but not rusted, which meant someone had maintained them. Inside was a large open room, the old passenger waiting area, with a tongue-and-groove pine ceiling gone amber with age, rows of built-in wooden benches along the walls, a massive cast-iron radiator along the far wall that was cold and silent, a ticket window with its frosted glass still intact. The floor was wide plank pine worn pale and smooth. Light came in through tall windows along the lakeside, and the lake was right there through the glass, gray and flat and immense. The room smelled of cold wood and something underneath it. Not quite mothballs, not quite cedar, something older and drier. The smell a room holds when it has been closed for a long time around something it was asked to keep. Delia walked the length of it slowly. Her footsteps on the pine floor made the sound of a room that hasn't heard footsteps in a while. She ran her hand along the smooth top of one of the benches. She looked at the ticket window. She looked at the radiator, the ceiling, the lake through the tall windows. She did not know yet what she was looking for. It was the message that found her, not the other way around. Tucked into the ticket window slot, sealed in an envelope gone slightly yellow at the edges, with her name written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Estelle's handwriting, which was the handwriting of a woman who had learned to print clearly, because she had spent 34 years writing measurements and order numbers on hardware slips. Precise and unhurried and utterly legible. Delia. She did not open it immediately. She put it in her coat pocket and walked to the window and stood there, looking at the lake for a long time the way you stand before opening something you understand. You cannot unopen. Then she went back to the middle bench and sat down and opened the envelope. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, if this story is finding you somewhere in the middle of something hard, take just a moment and hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. We make these stories for people who sit with them all the way to the end. Now let's go back to Delia and the letter. The letter was 2 pages, written on the same lined notepad paper Estelle had kept in the kitchen drawer her whole life for grocery lists. Delia, if you are reading this, Gerald has finally reached you, which means I am gone, and I want you to know I am sorry I waited until I was gone to say what I am about to say. It was a coward's timing, and I knew it when I chose it, and I chose it anyway, because I am better at putting things in writing than I ever was at saying them out loud to your face, which is a failing I know you inherited, and I know you know where you got it from. I have owned this building for 22 years. I bought it with the insurance money from your father's death, not all of it, but most of what I had managed to save back from the years. And I told you I put that money in a GIC for your brother's schooling, which was a lie I told because I did not know how to explain the truth yet. And then the explaining kept not happening until it was simply too late to explain. The truth is that I knew this building from when I was a young woman. I came through this landing 23 times between 1971 and 1974 on the ferry service that still ran then, going back and forth between here and Manitoulin Island, because I had a summer job at a fishing lodge on the island, and I was putting myself through teacher's college. And the ferry was cheaper than driving around. I was going to be a teacher, Delia. I don't know if I ever told you that. I was 20 years old, and I was going to teach elementary school, and I had a plan and I was following it. And then one crossing, coming back in October of 1974, the weather turned and the ferry was delayed 8 hours in this building, this very room, and I was tired, and I was frightened, and I was 23 years old, and I had $17 left until payday, and I did not know a single person on that ferry. And a woman named Augustina. She worked the ticket window. She had worked it for years, came out from behind the glass with a thermos of tea and a butter tart she had made that morning, and she sat down beside me on this bench, this one, and she just stayed. She didn't try to fix anything. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She just sat there in that particular way that some people have of making a room feel less like a trap and more like a shelter. And after a while I started talking, the way you talk in a crisis to a stranger you will never see again. And I told her about the teaching college and the money and the plan, and she listened, and at the end she said something I never forgot. She said some people only need somewhere to catch their breath. That's all a waiting room is, really. Somewhere to catch your breath before you go on. I caught my breath that night. I got on the ferry the next morning, and I went back, and I finished the year, and I met your father, and you know the rest. Or you know most of it. But I never forgot Augustina, and I never forgot this room. And when your father died and there was the insurance money and this building came up for sale, decommissioned, the ferry service long gone by then. I bought it. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I couldn't let it go to someone who would tear it down. And then I found out what had been happening inside it. The previous owner, a man named Haber who ran a small contracting business and had used part of the building for storage, had been, without advertising it, without telling anyone officially, without asking for any compensation, leaving the main doors unlocked every night. This building sat on the highway. People saw the lights he left on, just a work lamp plugged into the outlet by the door, nothing grand, and people stopped. Travelers. A woman and her kids whose car had broken down. A man who had walked away from something and had nowhere else to go that night. Young people who had run out of money between here and somewhere else. He kept a cot in the back room and a kettle on a camp stove, and he just left it open. He had been doing it for 11 years. When I bought the building, he came to see me. He was embarrassed, I think, worried I would tell him to stop. Instead, I asked him to teach me what he knew about maintaining the generator and the roof. And we kept it open together for 4 more years until he moved to be near his daughter in Timmins. And then I kept it open alone for 18 more. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a good person. I am telling you because I want you to understand what this building is. It is not property, Delia. It is a habit. A very old habit, started by a ferry company that could no longer remember why it had originally written, waiting room always open above its own door, kept alive by an embarrassed contractor, and then by a woman from Chapleau who never managed to explain it to her own daughter. I am leaving it to you not because I think you should keep it running. That is entirely your choice, but because I want you to know it exists. I want you to know that I spent 22 years keeping a light on in a building on the highway, and that it was the best thing I ever did, and I never told a single soul. Not because I was modest, because a thing like that loses something when you talk about it. It only works if nobody is watching. Behind the ticket window, on the shelf below the cash drawer, there's no cash. There hasn't been cash in 40 years. There is a blue binder. I kept records. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I am a woman who was trained to write things on paper and I could not stop myself. Find the binder, Delia. Then decide. Your mother, Estelle. If this story is landing somewhere true for you right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And hit subscribe so we can keep making stories like this one. Now let's get back to what Delia found behind that ticket window. The ticket window was not locked. The frosted glass panel slid sideways on its track with the particular stiff reluctance of something that had not been moved in a while but was not broken. Behind it was a narrow shelf, and below the shelf, exactly where Estelle had said it would be, was a blue 3-ring binder. Its cover faded but its spine intact, the kind of binder you could buy at any Staples for $3. Delia lifted it out and carried it to the bench by the window and opened it. The first page was in Estelle's printing, that clear, unhurried hand, catching their breath. Lake Huron Landing, Thessalon. A record kept by Delia Marchetti, 2002 present. She turned the page. The binder was not organized the way a ledger might be organized. It was organized the way a woman who worked a hardware counter organized things, by date, in columns, with a brisk efficiency that had no room for sentiment in the margins, but could not quite keep the sentiment out of the entries themselves. Date, weather note, number of people, what was needed, what was given, and then a single line, sometimes just a few words, sometimes more, that Estelle had written about the person or the people who had stopped. First hard frost, 2002. One man, late 50s, walking, gave coffee and the use of the phone. He called his son. They spoke for a long time. He left before morning. March 4, 2004, blizzard 40 centimeters overnight. Family of 4, Quebec plates. Stranded on 17, 2 nights. Kids slept on the cots. Father fixed the west window latch before they left. He was a carpenter, he said, and couldn't leave a thing unfixed. Left a 20 on the bench that I found after they were gone. July 2005. A girl, maybe 19. She would not say where she was going. She ate and slept and left early. She was wearing long sleeves in July. I did not ask. And then in the margin beside that July entry, in ink of a slightly different color, added later. She came back the following spring. She had short sleeves on. She left a card. It had a picture of a lake on it, and on the back it said, "This is the first place I ever felt safe enough to sleep." Delia turned pages. The entries went on. Year after year, winter and summer, dozens of people, hundreds of small transactions of shelter and coffee, and a dry place to wait out whatever needed waiting out. She read about an elderly Cree man traveling west who had sat with Estelle for 2 hours talking about his wife who had died the previous year, about a young couple from Newfoundland who had been making for Vancouver and 3 provinces short, and had spent 4 days in the landing, helping Estelle patch a section of the roof while they waited for a money transfer to come through. About a teenager alone on a bicycle who had written something in English and French on the back of a ferry schedule and left it on the bench. Estelle had taped it in. It read, "Vous n'êtes pas obligé de parler pour aider quelqu'un." You don't have to talk to help someone. That must have pleased her mother enormously, Delia thought. Estelle Delia Marchetti, who had never once in her life volunteered more words than a situation required, validated finally in print, and scattered through the entries, the way her mother had apparently scattered things through her whole life. Quietly, without announcement, in the margins, were small sentences Estelle had written to herself. Not wisdom, more like notes from a person doing a job and occasionally looking up to record what they noticed. People always apologize for needing somewhere to stop. Why do we train them to do that? A road is not a failure. A road is how you get somewhere. The ones who are running and the ones who are lost look exactly the same from the outside. They both just need the door to be open. Delia sat on that bench in the pale March light from the lake windows and read her mother's entire binder, and her hands shook from about page 20 onward, and she did not stop until she reached the last entry, dated 2 weeks before Estelle's stroke. January 8. Cold, clear. One young man, couldn't have been more than 22. He came in at 2 in the morning, and he sat on the end bench near the door, and he didn't say anything, and I didn't ask him anything, and we sat there together in the work lamplight for about an hour. And then he said, and these were the first words he'd said. He said, "Does it ever feel like you're just running in a circle back to the same place?" And I said, "Sometimes the circle is the point. Sometimes the place you keep coming back to is trying to tell you something." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "What do you think it's trying to tell me?" And I said that it's where you're supposed to be. He left around 4. I made eggs. He ate like a person who had not eaten properly in some days. I don't know his name. I didn't ask. I hope he is well. I hope the circle brought him somewhere good. That was the last entry. Delia sat with the closed binder in her lap for a long time after that. Outside, the lake had gone from pewter to a colder blue as the light shifted. The cast-iron radiator stood silent and cold against the far wall, and the pine benches ran their clean lines around the room, and the ticket window stood open the way. Her mother had apparently left it every night for 22 years, so that anyone who came to the door would know there was someone on the other side. She had misread her mother her entire adult life. She had understood Estelle as a woman who had contracted, drawn her world carefully smaller after her husband died, kept things contained, called on Sundays for 20 minutes, and then claimed she had something on the stove. Delia had believed that contraction was grief, or maybe just temperament. She had not understood that her mother had been elsewhere, that Estelle Delia Marchetti had been here on this bench, in this room, year after year in the dark, keeping a pot of coffee warm for people whose names she mostly never learned. She had not understood that the contraction she'd observed was not smallness. It was focus. Her mother had been paying attention to something, very quietly for a very long time, and had never once mentioned it, because Estelle understood, and had apparently always understood, that you cannot keep a door open and talk about keeping it open at the same time. The talking undoes it. The only way to do it is to just do it. Delia put the binder carefully back on the shelf behind the ticket window. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at the lake. Then she went to the wall outlet near the door and plugged in the work lamp that was still there. A plain utility lamp on a cord, the kind you would find in any hardware store in this country for $19. The lamp came on. It threw a square of yellow light through the window onto the snow outside. She stood there and looked at it from inside, and then she went outside into the cold and turned around and looked at it from the road. It was visible. You could see it from the highway. It was nothing special. A square of yellow in a white building on a gray March afternoon. But it was there, and it was on, and in this country, in this season, on this particular stretch of road, a lit window and an unlocked door was not nothing. It was almost everything. She drove back into Thessalon and found Gerald Ouellet's office still open. She went up the stairs and knocked, and he let her in, and she sat down across from him and she said, "I want to know what it would take to bring the heating system back online." Gerald Ouellet looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected from a man in his 70s, who had been practicing small-town law for 46 years. He smiled. Not a polite professional smile, the real kind. "I was hoping," he said, "that you were going to say that." He told her what he had not told her over the phone, because he, like her mother, apparently understood the value of letting a person find things in the right order. Estelle, he said, had set aside a maintenance fund. Not large. Estelle did not have large amounts of money to set aside, but careful. 22 years of careful. Every month a small transfer from her personal account into a designated account that Gerald had held in trust since 2002. Heat, roof, electrical, water. The basics, and only the basics. Because Estelle had understood that this building needed to remain exactly what it was and not become anything else. The fund held $41,000. More than that. Estelle had filed a heritage designation application for the building in 2018, which had been approved the following year. The ferry terminal was now a protected heritage structure under Ontario law. It could not be demolished. It could not be commercially developed. It was legally required to remain in some functional form a public-facing structure. Someone, some person, or some organization had to be responsible for it. "Your mother," Gerald Ouellet said, with a kind of quiet admiration that was clearly not new but had also clearly not gotten old, understood that a good intention is only as permanent as the legal structure you build around it. He folded his hands on the desk. "The heritage designation means no developer can come in and flip this into condominiums. The maintenance fund means you have time, real time, to figure out what you want to do with it." He paused. "What do you want to do with it?" Looked at her hands, $4 in her account, a borrowed bed with a bar that found her spine at 3 in the morning, a job she was good at, and that was slowly, very slowly, and not yet, but she could feel it, running out of room for her to be as good at it as she wanted to be. She said, "I want to learn what she knew about keeping the generator running." She did not go back to Sudbury that night. She called Priya from the car and asked if she could have another week. And Priya, who had been her friend for 14 years, and who had pressed that sticky note to her monitor with exactly the right gentleness, said, "Of course, take what you need." And Delia drove back out along the lakeshore road in the gathering dark, and the lamp in the window of the ferry terminal was still on because she had left it on, and it threw its square of yellow out across the snow as she turned into the gravel apron, and she sat in the car for a moment looking at it. She had kept that lamp burning all afternoon without realizing that was what she was doing. She went inside, and the cold was significant but not desperate, and she found in the back room behind the waiting area the things her mother had left there. 2 heavy wool blankets in a cedar chest, a camp stove and a tin of fuel, a box of matches and a kettle, a bag of coffee, a stack of foam sleeping pads. And on the camp stove, a handwritten note in Estelle's printing, protected in a Ziploc bag, with the particular forethought of a woman who knows how to store things. For whoever needs them, use what's here. Leave it tidy for the next one. That was all the instruction manual her mother had left. For whoever needs them, leave it tidy for the next one. Delia made coffee on the camp stove and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and sat on the bench nearest the lamp, and looked out at the dark lake and the darker tree line against the sky. And she thought about her mother, not the mother she had known, or thought she had known, but the mother she had apparently not known at all. The woman who had come through this very room on a ferry crossing in 1974, and been given tea, and a butter tart, and a person who sat with her without trying to fix anything, and who had spent the next 5 decades trying to give that same thing back. Who had done it so quietly and so consistently that her own daughter had never once known it was happening. Delia had spent her whole working life sitting with people who had run out of road. She had known, professionally, for 21 years, what it meant to be in a room with someone who had nothing left but the next hour. She had thought that was the skill, the professional skill, the trained one, the one that came with supervision and case files and organizational frameworks. She understood now, sitting in her dead mother's waiting room with the lamp lit and the lake dark outside, that the skill was older than any of that. It had come from a woman who learned it on a ferry crossing in a storm, from another woman behind a ticket window, who had come out with a thermos and sat down and stayed. The skill was as old as the idea of a door. It did not require a credential. It required the decision, made daily, to leave the light on. The first person came the following evening. She had spent the day on the phone with the heating contractor Gerald had recommended, with the Heritage Foundation administrator, with her own landlord in Sudbury about the timeline on her room rental. She had swept the main floor and wiped down the benches, and propped the front door open in the late afternoon to air the room out, and she had put the camp stove on the front bench near the window, where the light would fall on it visibly from the road, with the kettle already filled from the utility sink in the back. It was a woman in her late 30s, maybe 40, driving a car with a cracked side mirror and a Quebec plate partly obscured by road salt. She pulled into the gravel apron slowly, the way people pull in when they are not sure if they are allowed to. She sat in the car for a few minutes. Then she got out, and she stood outside the door, and she read the old sign above it, "Waiting room always open." And she looked uncertain, the particular uncertainty of someone who has learned not to count on things. Delia called through the prop door, "Come in, it's warm, we're just getting the heat working again, but there's hot coffee." The woman came in. She sat at the end of the bench near the door. Same bench Estelle had noted the young man sitting at. Near the exit, the way people sit when they are not sure they are staying. She wrapped both hands around the mug Delia gave her, and she looked at the lake through the tall windows, and she did not say anything. And Delia did not ask her anything. They sat that way for a while. The lamp threw its square of yellow light. The lake went on being enormous and dark and indifferent in the beautiful way that large bodies of water are indifferent, not coldly, just at a scale that makes the human problems in front of them feel briefly, mercifully, a different size. Eventually the woman said, "I wasn't sure if I should stop." Delia said the door was open. The woman nodded. She looked at her coffee. Then she said, quietly, "I didn't know places like this still existed." Delia thought about her mother, about a woman who had learned to print clearly because of 34 years of hardware slips, about 22 years of entries in a blue binder, about $41,000 moved a little at a time into a trust bank account so that the door would not have to close when she was gone, about a letter on grocery list notepad paper that began with an apology and ended with, "Find the binder, Delia. Then decide." She had decided. Not in one great moment, but in the accumulated quiet of a day and a half in a room that smelled of cold wood and very old coffee and the particular stubborn grace of a thing that had been kept open through every reason it had to close. She said to the woman, "It's been here a long time. My mother kept it open. Now I do." The woman looked at her. Something settled in her face. She stayed 2 nights. In the morning she helped Delia move the heavy cedar chest, and they discovered behind it the utility panel for the radiant heating system, and the woman, whose name turned out to be Benedict, though she did not offer this until the second morning, turned out to work in facilities management and understood electrical panels in the way a person understands the things they have spent years maintaining, which is to say, intuitively and without drama. The heat came on at 11 in the morning, ticking and settling through the old pipes, and it filled the room from the baseboards up with the dry warmth of a building remembering what it was built for. Benedicta left on the second afternoon with directions to a shelter in Sault Ste. Marie, and the phone number of a woman Delia knew there. She pressed a $20 bill into Delia's hand at the door, and Delia did not refuse it because her mother's binder had taught her that refusing is sometimes its own kind of condescension. She put it in a mason jar on the shelf behind the ticket window, which was where she intended to keep contributions of all kinds. Not revenue, not a fee, but the jar her mother had apparently kept in the same spot for the same purpose which Gerald confirmed when she described it to him. The jar had been empty when she arrived. She did not think it would stay empty long. She gave her notice in Sudbury 3 weeks later. It was a harder conversation than she had expected, and also an easier one, because her supervisor, a woman named Donna who had been running the resettlement organization for 16 years, and who understood, better than almost anyone, that some people know exactly what they are supposed to be doing, said, "I wondered when you were going to figure this out." And then, more quietly, "We'll keep in touch." And then, "Your mother would be." And she stopped and she pressed her lips together and she said, "We'll keep in touch." The heritage designation came with a small annual operating grant that Delia had not known about until the administrator mentioned it on a call in May. Not large but sufficient, combined with the maintenance fund, to keep the basics running through the first year while she figured out the rest. She applied for a charitable registration. She contacted the Métis Nation of Ontario about the history of the shore route the terminal had served. She found in a box in the back room a folder of photographs from the 1960s and 70s, the ferry service in operation. The dock crowded with passengers, Augustina behind the ticket window in a cardigan, smiling at someone outside the frame. Delia had the photo enlarged and framed and hung it on the wall beside the ticket window, because a place should know its own history, and so should the people who come to it. The people kept coming, slowly at first, and then with a gathering quiet regularity that reminded Delia of the way clients at the resettlement office would come, never in numbers that overwhelmed, but never stopping. A man who had lost his job in the Saw and was driving west to stay with his brother, a pair of young women on a road trip who had hit ice near Iron Bridge and were shaken and needed somewhere to sit until the shaking stopped. An elderly Anishinaabe woman from Manitoulin who came in one afternoon in August and sat for 2 hours looking at the photographs and then told Delia, without preamble, that she had taken the ferry 12 times in her 20s and that she had never imagined the landing still existed. Delia made tea, and they sat at the window bench and looked at the lake together, and the woman said, "The lake looks the same." And Delia said, "Some things know how to stay." The woman smiled. She came back 3 weeks later with her granddaughter. Delia kept records. She could not help it. It was in her, apparently, deeper than she had known, this compulsion to write things down so they would not disappear. She bought a new binder, navy blue, because Estelle's had been blue and she found she did not want to break the thread. She opened it to the first page and she wrote, in her own printing, not as neat as her mother's but legible, which had always been the point, catching their breath. Lake Huron Landing, Thessalon, a record kept by D. Marchetti. Continued from the record of E. Tremblay Marchetti, 2002-2023. Below it she wrote one line of her own. A road is not a failure. A road is how you get somewhere. ETM. She attributed it to her mother because it was her mother's. Because some inheritances are words, and words belong to the person who first knew how to say them. She called her brother Thierry in early September. It was the first time they had spoken properly in 2 years. The divorce had been a fault line in their relationship the way divorce often is in families. Everyone trying not to choose sides and ending up anyway on one. She told him about the landing, and about the binder, and about the $41,000, and the heritage designation and the photograph of Augustina. There was a long silence on Thierry's end of the line. He said, "She never told me any of this." Delia said, "She never told me either." Another silence. Then, "Why do you think she didn't tell us?" And Delia said what she had come to understand in the months since March, sitting in a waiting room on the north shore of Lake Huron, with the lamp on and the lake outside and the binder open on her knees, because the telling would have made it about her. And it was never about her. It was about whoever walked through the door. Thierry was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I think I want to come and see it." She said, "The door's open." The lamp burned every night that first autumn and winter. Delia slept in the back room on a proper cot she had brought from Sudbury, under her mother's wool blankets, with the work lamp on its cord, glowing through the interior window, so that the front room was never fully dark. She learned the building the way you learn a place you intend to stay in, its sounds, its cold spots, which window rattled in a north wind and which held tight, where the light fell golden in the morning, and where it went blue in the late afternoon just before the lake ate the sun. She learned to be alone in it, and she found, as Estelle must have found, as perhaps Hébert before her had found, that this kind of alone was not the same as lonely. Lonely was what she had been in a house in New Sudbury for the last several years of her marriage, surrounded by the furniture of a shared life and the silence of a man who had drifted out of reach, so gradually she had not noticed until the distance was already enormous. This was different. This was the full inhabited solitude of a person doing a thing that needed doing, in a room that was always ready, always warm enough, always lit. She understood something her mother had tried to write toward in the margins of the binder and had not quite found the words for. The keeping open was not charitable. It was not generous in the way generosity usually means, from abundance outward. It was something more symmetrical than that. The people who came through the door gave the room its reason. Without them, it was just a building with a heritage plaque. With them, with the man who called his son and the girl in long sleeves in July, and the couple from Newfoundland who fixed the roof, and every other person who had sat on these pine benches in the lamplight and caught their breath. It was what Augustina had called it in 1974, a waiting room. A place where the waiting itself is not failure but preparation. Not an ending but a pause before continuing. Delia thought about Renee, who had been lonely in a way that had nothing to do with whether another person was in the room. She thought about what it would have been like if he had found a room like this at the right time. Not to be fixed, not to be counseled, just to sit in the light for a while, until the next thing was clearer. She thought about herself at 32, signing the mortgage paperwork with her name missing from it, and not asking why, not because she was foolish, but because she had not yet learned that the things you don't ask about are the ones that find you later. She thought about all the roads that had felt like detours. Her mother had been right. A road is not a failure. A road is how you get somewhere. She was 54 years old, and she had lost a marriage and a house and a life she had built across 3 decades, and she had come. The way you come to things that were always there waiting, that required losing everything else before you could find them. To the one place that turned out to have been held ready for her, kept warm by a woman who had never quite managed to say out loud, "This is for you. This has always been for you." It was her mother's greatest gift, and it had arrived, as the best gifts sometimes do, exactly late enough. On the last night of October, the first real cold of the season settling across the shore, Delia walked to the front door and stood in it for a moment, looking out at the highway. The lamp was on behind her. The lake was black and still. The birch trees had lost the last of their leaves and stood pale and bare against the dark. A truck went by on Highway 17, its lights sweeping across the gravel apron, and then it was past and the night was quiet again. She thought she heard, faint and far off, the sound of another vehicle slowing on the grade. Could be anyone. Could be no one. Could be someone who had been driving for too many hours and saw the light and thought, maybe. She left the door open. That is the thing about waiting rooms on long roads. They do not stop travelers from traveling. They do not fix what is broken or decide what comes next. They only do the one small thing that turns out to matter more than almost anything else. They stay lit. They hold the door. They say, in the only language a building knows, you do not have to be lost to need somewhere to stop. You only have to be on your way. Delia Marchetti was 54 years old, and she had come to the end of one road and found, right where it stopped, a door her mother had left open. She walked back inside, and the lamp glowed on the snow outside the window, and the old pine floor held the sound of her steps the way it had held 1,000 others, and she sat down at the bench by the window and opened the navy blue binder, and she picked up her pen, and she wrote, "If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you want to keep hearing quiet stories like this one, stories about the doors people leave open and the ones we find just in time, subscribe to Epic Stories, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We read every single one.